Today we're going to install the Superlift 2-inch leveling kit on this 2019 Ram 1500 four-wheel drive. Now this is specific to the standard four-wheel drive truck, not the TRX models or with factory air ride. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so I've gone ahead and got this truck up off the ground. I've disconnected the battery and removed the wheels. Next, I want to turn my attention to the ABS sensor line. Now I've got 3 bracket areas I need to pull that away from. One is right here at the brake line, one's on the back side of the steering knuckle, and one is on the bottom of the upper control arm. I'm going to do this first, pull it away from the brake line bracket, just snap it out of there, and next I'm going to come down here to the steering knuckle. Snap that out like so. And on the upper control arm, we're going to go up underneath here and get it loose from that bracket. All right, next we're going to disconnect our tie rod and get that out of the way. We're going to use a 21 millimeter, slide up on the nut itself. We're going to break that loose. Once it's broken loose, we'll probably need to hold on to the bottom portion of it with a 10 millimeter. And continue to loosen it up. Now this truck is pretty new, so the tie rod's just kind of pulling right out. If you've got a truck that's got a few miles on it, you may need to either use a tie rod puller, or if you don't have a tie rod puller, you can take a hammer and smack the steering knuckle right here to jar the tie rod loose. Just don't hit the tie rod with that hammer. Okay, next what we're going to do is remove the caliper and set that off to the side. Now I've got a caliper hanger bracket, and there's a nice little convenient hole on top of the frame right over here, so I can hang the bracket or hang that caliper out of the way. Now if you don't have a caliper hanger bracket, whenever you set that caliper out of the way, make sure you use some kind of strap or a bungee strap. You just don't want the caliper hanging on that brake line that can fatigue the brake line. So what we're going to do, since I don't have a tie rod attached, I can go ahead and move this over. We've got a couple of bolts. We can use a 21 millimeter to break those loose, and the caliper will come right off. Just make sure as you're loosening this up, pay very close attention not to break it loose and hit your brake lines. You don't want to damage that. All right, once they're broken loose, we're going to go ahead and finish pulling them off with our ratchet. All right, next what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a floor jack and support the bottom of the lower control arm. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lift it up just a touch, just making sure that I'm removing any kind of pressure off of the lower control arm. All right, next we're going to go ahead and loosen up our 2 upper control arm bolts. We're going to use a 21 millimeter wrench to do that. Next, what we want to do is go ahead and loosen up the nut coming out of the ball joint from the upper control arm going through the steering knuckle. We're going to use a 21 millimeter. Now, before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and set my tie rod back in place just to keep that steering knuckle from rotating around while I loosen it up. Now, once I break this loose, if that bolt spins, I can hold this tight down here with a 10 millimeter. All right, next what we need to do is we need to break this bolt free from the knuckle. Now this is a tapered bolt, so it's fit in there up nice and tight. Now you can either use a puller tool to press that through, or if you don't have the puller tool, you can hit this portion of the knuckle with a mallet or a hammer. Just make sure you do not hit the upper control arm or the ball joint. All right, so next I'm going to go ahead and pull my tie rod back out. Set that off to the side. Go ahead and finish pulling this nut off of the lower or the upper control arm bolt. We can also at this time go ahead and remove the floor jack. We're going to keep it underneath there just for a little bit extra support because we don't want to allow our axle get hyperextended. Now our sway bar end link is going to come down and go through the lower control arm. There's a nut underneath there holding that in place. We're going to pull that off with an 18 millimeter. Now I'm going to go ahead and start undoing that. If that starts to spin, what we can do is we can hold the end of that bolt still with an 8 millimeter and use an 18 millimeter wrench to finish pulling the bolt off. Now we're going to go ahead and do that on the other side as well. Then once that's broken free, we're going to go ahead and rotate that sway bar up and get both sides free from the lower control arm. All right, next we're going to remove the bolt from the lower control arm mount. On the lower control arm, what we're going to use is a 21 millimeter on this side, and on the inside is a 24 millimeter. Now before I remove the strut, I'm going to mark the alignment of the coil, the top mount, and the isolator. I'm going to use a silver Sharpie. I'm also going to mark on here P for a passenger side strut. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and pull my upper control arm down and out of the way. Now I can move my plastic shielding away. Now if there is any kind of cable harnesses that are attached to these, go ahead and pull those away first. I'm going to go ahead and take a 16 millimeter and loosen up all these nuts. Go ahead and remove them off the top of the strut assembly. All right, now I'm gonna go ahead and lift up my upper control arm. That way I can get my assembly out. Now, at this point, this needs to be pushed down. Lower control arm needs to be pushed down. It might be helpful to take a pry bar and put it through this hole and push down on the lower control arm to get this strut assembly out. Just be really careful. We don't want to overextend our axle. Okay, now I've already got this set up on our in-shop spring compressor. Now we've got a wall mount. Most people don't have that at their house, but if you're working from your home, what you can do is you can pick up spring compressor tools from the parts store. Typically they'll have a rental setup, but anyway, those are available. Now, because of the nature of this particular type of strut, it does have a recessed 18mm nut in there, so you can't use a regular socket set. First, before you go forward, double check, make sure your mark is in place so that your isolator, your coil, and your top mount are all clearly marked and lined up. And what I'm going to use here, this is what I found to be the easiest way to use all this. I've got a go-through socket set that's going to go right in and mount to that or line up to that socket. But if I were to start loosening that up, the whole thing's going to spin. So now I've also got an 8mm small socket that's going to go up through the top, and now I can go ahead and loosen up that socket. Now, before you completely take that socket off, you want to make sure you've got spring compression on there to where it doesn't snap apart. So I'm going to go ahead and put down some spring pressure and take the pressure off of it. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and finish taking the nut loose from the shaft. All right, now before I completely remove this nut from the top of the assembly to take it apart, I'm going to go ahead and compress this spring down enough to where the spacer would fit in between the coil and the bottom mount. That way, when it's pushed up, I know it would fit in the top. So I'll get that spacing at the bottom first. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and finish removing that nut from the top. All right, once the nut is completely off, go ahead and gently lower the shock out. Now at this time we can go ahead and pull up on the top plate. That's going to separate from the isolator. Next, what we're going to do is take our spacer, put it in place, and then drop that back down on top of the isolator. We're going to make sure that our marks are all lined up, and then we're going to go ahead and raise this back into place. Once that's back in place, we can go ahead and put our nut back in place, get that threaded on. Once that's threaded on, then we can go ahead and tighten everything back up. As you tighten it up, make sure that these lines stay lined up. It's going to shift around and all that, so right before you completely tighten it up, make sure everything's lined back up. Also make sure at the bottom the coil is lined up to the base of the coil frame down at the bottom. Also, the coil is going to be dead all the way up against the isolator at the top. All right, Now that we've got that put back together, we're going to go ahead and pull the tension back off of the coil. Just be careful with any kind of coil stuff. You don't want anything to break loose and start doing any kind of damage. All right, now we're going to go ahead and take our new modified assembly, drop it into place. We're going to go ahead and take our pry bar, pry on the bottom of the lower control arm to where we can drop it in. I want to make sure everything is lined up the way it came out. All right, next we're going to go ahead and push our upper control arm back down, lift up on the strut, and reinstall our 3 factory nuts on top of the strut assembly. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave those loose for right now. We're just going to get them lined up and attached. That way we can line up the lower strut mount to the lower control arm. All right, now what we're going to do is go ahead and reattach our sway bar end link to our lower control arm. Now we are using factory hardware. We're just lining it up right now and fastening the hardware in place. We're not going to tighten it down just yet. We're going to do that until we actually have the weight of the vehicle pushing down. Now, what you'll probably need to do is do both sides at the same time because this is attached to the sway bar, so they're connected. And like I said, just attach the hardware for right now. Everything that I've done on this side, I've also done on the driver's side. So when we're putting it back together, just make sure the sway bar is connecting on both sides simultaneously. Now, using the factory hardware, we're going to go ahead and reattach the lower strut mount to the lower control arm. Now, on the outside, we've got a 21 millimeter. On the inside, we've got a 24 millimeter. We're going to get those snug but not tight yet. We're not actually going to tighten it down until we have the truck all the way on the ground, full weight on suspension. All right, next we're going to go ahead and reattach the upper control arm to the steering knuckle, again using factory hardware. And we can go ahead and tighten that down to 37 foot-pounds. We're using a 21 millimeter wrench and a 10 millimeter wrench. All right, next we're going to reinstall our factory tie rod into place onto the steering knuckle, again using a 21 millimeter and a 10 millimeter. And we're going to get this to 44 foot-pounds. All right, next we're going to go ahead and with a 16 millimeter, we're going to go ahead and tighten down the nuts at the top of our strut mount, and then we'll go back and torque them down to 37 foot-pounds. All right, now typically on the driver's side, you're gonna have the 2 clips that hold on to a wire harness. Go ahead and reattach those once you got these tightened down. All right, next what we're gonna do is reinstall the factory brake caliper. I'm gonna slide that in place, use the factory hardware. Once we line it all up, we're gonna torque it down to factory specs. Before we insert that hardware, we are going to put a little bit of thread locker on. And again, we're using a 21 millimeter. Now we're going to go ahead and reconnect the 3 ABS lines. I'm doing the one to the back of the steering knuckle first, then to the bottom of the upper control arm, and then to the brake line last. Now you should have everything all nice and tightened up. We are not going to tighten up the upper control arm bolts, the sway bar end link, or the lower strut mount until we actually have the weight of the vehicle on the ground. But go ahead and put the wheels and tires on it this time. Well, we went ahead and reconnected the battery. Then with the new wheels and tires on there, we went ahead and dropped it on the ground, shaked it up and down a little bit to get everything to settle, got underneath the truck. We tightened down the sway bar end links, the lower strut mount, and the upper control arm bolts. Now we got all that back to factory spec. Next, we're gonna take this to the alignment shop and get it realigned. Once that's done, after about 100 miles or so, we're gonna get back underneath there, tighten everything down, make sure everything's still within spec. One other thing we're gonna do, since the front end is now up a little bit, we're gonna re-aim the headlights, get them back down where they're supposed to be. That concludes the installation. If you have any questions, call the experts or come visit us online.